Yeah, so, dear colleagues, it's our pleasure and honor to welcome today Dr. Хайке Хенниг-Шмидт from, I would say, I will still say Higher School of Economics.
Yeah, that's good.
And the Bonn, University of Bonn. And Heike is a long-time friend and collaborator and colleague of ours, and many of us know Heike already for quite some time. And Heike, we appreciate very much what you have done for the development of experimental economics in Russia. This is very instrumental, I would say, in the success of many endeavors, and we appreciate very much that we can continue this cooperation, notwithstanding the circumstances around us and not necessarily favorable for research. So Heike's talk is going to be about basically climate change issues, but from a perspective which is quite common in many academic and social contexts, right? And without talking about anymore, Heike, thanks for coming again, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to talk at least via Zoom to you. I really would have liked to join you in person, but it's always not possible, so it's better to have this occasion. Okay, what I'm talking about is CO2 emission reduction, and it's a laboratory experiment with large groups. And what is special is that we provide a real public good in the laboratory. We provide CO2 emission reduction. I will tell you how things work. My co-authors are Joachim Weimann, Janet Rosich-Koch, Timo Heinrich, and Claudia Keser. And you will see in some minutes why we have so many co-authors. By the way, if you have any questions, somehow let Alexis know, and so I can explain them immediately. And Alexis, please let me know maybe 5 minutes before my time, my speaking time is over, so that I have maybe to speed up a little bit. Okay. Yeah, what is my motivation? For developed societies, solving cooperation problems is becoming increasingly important. And, well, societies are large groups, and therefore it's important that the cooperation problems of large groups that are among the most important and at the same time most difficult challenges somehow are somehow solved. And probably the outstanding example of our time is climate change. So this global public good that really affects the whole world, more or less, of climate protection can only be provided if many make a voluntary contribution. Usually you cannot force them, you have to make a voluntary contribution. Now in this paper, in the paper I'm talking about, we experimentally study and compare contributions made to a real public good. I will call it RPG in the following, and this is deleting CO2 emission rights. And I compare it with the monetary public good, the VCM, the voluntary contribution mechanism, that is provided only in the laboratory, and that is the usual mechanism in experimental economics that is used to study public goods. Let me see. Yeah. Now, the problem with the voluntary contribution mechanism or in public goods is there is a typical incentive problem that arises in the provision of public goods. That is, from an individual perspective, subjects should not contribute. For them, it's better to keep their money and wait and hope that others contribute to solve the problem. But from a group perspective, all subjects should contribute. And the problem is how to motivate people to contribute even if they think it's better for them not to do so. And let me briefly explain the voluntary contribution mechanism. So thinking about groups with more than 2 members, and in climate change it's really, of course, a very, very large group. Each member, it's usually how the experiment is designed. Each member has an endowment, gets an endowment, EI. And all group members decide simultaneously about the contribution to the public good, which we call CI. Now, you have CI, you have EI, your endowment, and you can decide whether to contribute it to the public good or to keep it. So, and to keep it we call private good. So your private good is EI, your endowment, minus what you have contributed. The total contribution in the public good are multiplied by a factor K to determine the value of the public good. So that means it's better for all of the people in the group to contribute to the public good. The public good is worth more than the sum of the contributions. And the income from the public good for each player I is the total value of the public good, which is the sum of contributions times K, and this is divided by the number of group members. So you get the sum multiplied divided by the number of group members. Now, if we say, well, Kn equals alpha, then the payoff function for the player, or what you get if you are part of this group, is what you keep and what you get from the public good. Now the dilemma arises, is alpha smaller than 1, because then if you get less from the public good than if you keep it. But on the other hand, it would make, if all contribute, then you get more. This is the dilemma. This is the problem. This has to be solved somehow. Now the VCM, this voluntary contribution mechanism, has been used in thousands of public good experiments to study the problem. What can groups solve the dilemma? How do they deal with it? How are the dynamics? And the VCM has been used in thousands of public good experiments, and typically they employ small groups, less than 10 subjects usually. It's more often it's only 3 or 4 people. Of course, but CO2 emission reduction, of course, involves much larger groups. But still, let's first see what happens in small groups. Small groups can partially solve the cooperation problem, has been found. People contribute about 30 to 40% usually it's in the first interaction, so it's usually a multi-period interaction. But in contributions decrease with repetition and sometimes dramatically. Now, what to expect from large group behavior? Usually we see, well, in some way the dilemma can be solved in small groups, but what happens in large groups? And the same co-authors that I mentioned before on the first slide, we published a paper about large group contributions to a public good experiment. And what we study were large groups of 60 and 100 people who play the public good simultaneously. We did this by combining 4 laboratories in Germany. I'll tell you later on which one, and that's the reason why we have so many co-authors, because each of those who contribute to the paper also run part of the experiment in the laboratory. Now, what you can see here is that large groups behave similarly and realize about the same level of contributions. We had 8-person groups, where 8 persons are together in a group, and we had 100 person in a group, which meant that 25 were in each of the laboratory and they were combined. And what you see here is that in the 8-person group and the 100-person groups, the dynamics were rather similar. What is also important is the alpha. Alpha is different in these experiments. Alpha is this factor here, but this has to do with the structure of the public good game. I won't talk about that now. What I want to say is that the VCM, this voluntary contribution mechanism in the laboratory, can be solved in a way. So in the beginning, people contribute 40% of the endowment that they have, but then it decays rather, sometimes, as you can see, nearly to less than 10%. And the reason, which has been found or studied intensely by Gechter and Fischbacher, is that there are imperfect conditional cooperators, which means they see what the others do, the average about, and then they contribute a little bit less than what the others do. And if you have a lot of these people who always look what the others do, but do not contribute as much as they do, but less, then this decay can be observed. Okay, this is now about the VCM, this public good that is created in the laboratory, but with large groups. And our first research question is now, do people behave differently when they contribute to CO2 emission reduction? I first explain the VCM treatments. That's more or less what I showed you before, but that you know exactly how our experiment looks like. So in this experiment, we had 30 and 60 members of a group, and they are facing an identical decision situation during 10 consecutive rounds. That's what you saw here. These are the rounds, so they have the same problem. They have to deal with the others for 10 rounds. Each of the group members receive an endowment of 120 euro cents, and they can decide whether they keep the money or they contribute something or everything or nothing. And each contribution acts as creating an amount of 0.06x for each group member, which is this alpha that I mentioned before, including those who contribute. Now the payoff in euro cent per round is your endowment, 120, minus what you contribute, plus 0.06, plus the sum of all group members, so what everybody puts into the public good. And as I said before already, 0.06 is alpha, the marginal per capita return, is an MPCR, it's also called. Now let's look at the RPG, at this emission treatment. How does the design look? It looks rather similar, with one important with one very important difference. Again, 30 or 60 members of the group face the identical decision situation in 10 consecutive rounds, everything is the same, they get 120 euro cent as endowment, they can keep and contribute. And, but the sum of what all the people contributed will now be used to buy CO2 emission permits. I will explain in a minute what this means exactly, but just to tell you, this means if we buy these CO2 emission permits, then the number of tons that equal the CO2 emission permits will be deleted. So people really contribute to CO2 emission. And what in the payoff, now your payoff is these 120 minus your contribution, but they don't get anything back from the public good, which in the VCM, in the VCM they get some part of the public good back. In the emission treatment, they don't. And that's what I said already, no refund. Buying and withdrawing emission permits reduces CO2 emission by exactly the number of tons, what I've said before. But what you get from this is very, very small. There is an impact, but the impact is rather small compared to the whole number of people who also are contributing to CO2 emission.
In the VCM, this marginal effect of individual contribution is known. I told you before that this alpha in the experiment is 0.06. So they get 6 euro cents back for each euro cent contributed. And here, as I also mentioned before, these imperfect conditional cooperators create the downward spiral within the lab group. So those who, if they know what on average will be contributed, if they are informed about that, then they usually contribute less, and this creates the spiral. Now, to repeat, in the RPG emission reduction experiment, the real problem does not exist within the lab, but outside of the lab. And what has been found is that people are aware of the problem. So in other experiments, subjects do contribute to climate change mitigation in small groups, as well as individually. These are different kinds of experiment, different than what we do, but it's clear people are willing to contribute. And also, I guess in your private life, you also may separate. Oops, I have to see with the sun. Separate waste, yeah, maybe also in different ways you contribute to CO2 emission reduction. So we know that people do it, but how they do it in the experiment that we study. And the second question that we are interested in, what about feedback? In the VCM, usually people get feedback about quite a lot of things, and especially about the contributions of the other group members. And we are interested, do people react differently when getting information or not about the contributions of others in both kinds of experiments, in the RPG and in the VCM. Now, what to expect in the VCM, when they do not get feedback, this conditional cooperation phenomenon should not apply, which means if you don't know what the others do, then you can also not calculate the average, and then you cannot contribute less. So maybe the spiral, this downward trend is less, or even there is some kind of parallel parallel contribution behavior. But there is inconclusive evidence. It's not totally clear whether people without feedback are stable and remain at initial levels over 10 periods, even though Neugebauer et al. Already in an experiment found that people behave in a rather stable way. And with emission reduction, it's also not clear. In another kind of experiments where people are asked about their willingness to pay, there was no effect when sharing information on others' willingness, but it's a completely different experiment. And in another experiment, the willingness to pay when they were informed increases in others' cooperation. So we hope to shed some more light or get better insights into what happens, at least in the experimental setup that we are studying here. To explain to you, but also to the experiment about this mechanism of CO2 emission reduction in the emission treatments. So what this is, so we told subjects, as I mentioned already briefly before, if you buy or if anybody buys and withdraws emission permits, this reduces CO2 emission by exactly the number of tons for which rights were bought. And here you see the certificate that we got after the experiment for the number of tons that were bought. In Germany at that time, when we ran the experiment, that was in 2016-17, the average per capita CO2 emission in Germany were 12 tons per year. And the price for 1 ton CO2 emission was about €7. What we also did, we signed a declaration, each of the experimenter, and distributed this to the participants, that we committed to buy and withdraw the permits from the European Union emission trading systems, and that we later on will make the certification documents public on our website. We found out in pilot study that this was really important, that people believe us, that we do not keep the money for us, but that that we really will use it for CO2 emission reduction. So this was something that in experiments one has to take into account, that people really have to believe you and do not retain the money because they think, well, that's what they tell us, but whether we can trust is not so clear. And in the according to feedback and no feedback, the information people in the feedback conditions in the VCM and in the real public good game were the following. They were informed about the individual amount that they kept. So that's what they put in their private account, what they contributed. They were informed about the average contribution made by all group members. So what on average the 30 or 60 group members contributed. Then what you personally get from the public good, what is paid from the public good. The individual earnings in the round just completed, and the cumulated earnings over all completed rounds after each round, because you were interacting in 10 rounds. And so this is quite a lot of information where you can see what you get, what has been done before, and what your co-members, including yourself, did on average. In the no feedback information treatment, you didn't get anything of this, this information. You were just left with a problem. Shall I contribute or not? And if I contribute, then I know how much I keep, but nothing else. Yeah, just something about the procedure. Most of our treatments were run simultaneously in 4 laboratories in Bonn, where I'm coming from, in Duisburg-Essen, in Göttingen, and in Magdeburg. So quite distributed over Germany. And the 4 laboratories were connected via the internet. At that time, it was Z3. And so in the treatments with group sizes 60, 15 subjects participated in each laboratory and then were put together as a group. And they were informed about that. And everybody knew everything. And what we also did, we had a video, we showed them on video on the screen that there were these other laboratories, and so that they could see that we do not also there, that they can trust us, that we really have 4 laboratories connected. And since I had this experience with connecting laboratories in another experiment that we run in between Germany and Russia later on, we use this same technique. Okay, so sessions lasted for about 19 minutes and the average payoff was 15.36 euro. So quite a decent amount for students to earn in the laboratory. And we had a between subject design, which meant so all sessions were run with new subjects. So no subject participated twice. Are there any questions up to now? Well, if this is not the case, I will go on, but of course you can hopefully ask at the end that there is enough time for discussion.
You have about 15 more minutes.
Okay. Let me look at the, just to repeat the treatments that we have. So these different sessions. We had the 60 emission treatment. The group size was 60. The MPCR, so the impact you had on climate was very, very small. We had the number of independent observations, that is, we had 8 groups only, but these 8 groups comprised 480 subjects. So the number was not too large, that a number of groups, but on the other hand, I think the total experiment already involved more than 1,500 subjects. We had feedback and the laboratories were connected. Same thing for 30 emission. We had a group size of 30 and 240 subjects participated in a connected lab. And the no feedback treatment we run only in Magdeburg, because there each individual is one independent observation, because they do not interact with each other, because they did not have information on what the others did. We had tested before whether there was a difference between the laboratories in behavior. We didn't find any, so therefore we run the experiment, this more or less individual decision-making experiment, only in Magdeburg. And then we had the same treatments with VCM, where you get a refund or from the public good, also with 60 subjects, with 30 subjects, and with 30 subjects and no feedback. And that's altogether 1,500 subjects. And actually we have another paper, as I said before, where we have this large groups with 100. And I think in total we had more than 5,000 subjects in the total study. So this was really a large scale experiment. Okay, let me come to the results. What we found is that subjects contributed to CO2 emission reduction. We had 130 tons, which is not that much, but what we have also have to take into account, there were quite some fees that we had to pay until these certificates were released, and the CO2 tons were more or less deleted, but still. And so each of the 778 participants deleted emission rights of about 168 kilogram in the experiment. This was the certificate that we got. The University of Magdeburg were certificated that 131 tons of CO2 were deleted, and that's exactly the certificate was the one that we then sent to the subjects so that they could really verify that we paid the money as we had promised before. Now, what can we see? What can we say when comparing the VCM, the usual public good, where you get money back, and the emission treatment? And I have here the graph for the groups with 60 people and the group with 30 people. Here is the VCM, and what you can see in both treatments, that there is this decay that I have told you before. People start with 40%, and then at the end, after around 10, they contribute on average only 10%. And here it's nearly the same with 30%, 30 group members. But look now at the emission, the curve for the emission treatment. You see that they contribute something less in the beginning, but then there is a small decay in the beginning, but then contributions are rather stable, and here they even increase at the end. So it's a completely different dynamic that we see, and we see it in the same way also with groups of 30. Yeah, just as I said before, here the summary, and so this is, I think this is a very interesting finding. So it seems even this is the feedback treatment. Also, we find a group size effect, even though on the averages over group sizes look rather similar, but the average contributions are significantly higher in the large group and in the small group compared with the man-with-you test. In the RPG and the real public good, you don't find such an effect. So that you can see the test shows no evidence for a significant effect. So there are two very important differences between the two kinds of experiments. Now let's look at the feedback and no feedback conditions. This is the VCM, and it's the group of 30 and with these MPCR of 0.6. what you see is that we have seen before, but here you see that there is the decay is smaller. So they start lower, but they at the end they are much higher. The contributions are much higher than in the VCM experiment. It's not complete. It's not like in the real public good, but it's more stable. So it seems that giving no feedback has a stabilizing effect. So what we found no differences in contribution between no feedback and feedback treatments. Let me see there, I don't know whether, and the decay, maybe there's a mistake, but the decay of contributions in no feedback and in feedback, although it's smaller than in feedback. So okay, maybe I made a mistake there. Now let's look at the emission treatment. And what you see is that if you don't have don't get feedback, then contributions are even higher, but still, if you test it, there is no difference. So this is it shows that if there is no feedback, it has an effect in the MPCR, so it's stable, and in emission it's rather similar. Okay, so how can we conclude? In the VCM, there is this typical pattern of decreasing contributions. Larger groups contribute more, which is an interesting finding, what we also have found in the other study, which in a way contradicts Olsen's conjecture, saying that large groups cannot solve the dilemma, because the public good dilemma, because each of them have only a large impact. So this seems not the case in our study. And in no feedback, conditional cooperation gets difficult and the decay is lowered. In the RPG emission treatment, we found relatively stable contributions, no group size effect. And we found adaptation in the contributions mainly in the first round. So in a real world public good experiment, behavior changes significantly compared to the VCM. Now one could ask, why is this the case? Yeah, the RPG is different in that what is important in the real public good, in our real public and also in other real public good situations, is regarding the provision of the real public good, the behavior of all people involved in the task is constant from the perspective of an individual participant in the experiment. So, and in our task, most of the people, of course, are outside the lab. Who contributes to CO2 emission is at the moment when you run the experiment, there is no change in behavior. For you, it's constant. And if only a small subsample can be observed, the long-term dynamics do not seem to be influenced by this information. So if information about the average behavior of all people is available, as is the case in the VCM experiments, this might affect the dynamics of contributions. And therefore, if appropriate media coverage creates the impression that the general efforts to protect climate are not diminishing, then cooperation should be stabilized. That is, I may be willing to contribute, even not in an experiment, but outside, if I know that it makes sense, that other people are doing the same, that other people are also contributing. And for instance, as is the case in Germany, and then people also in the real world may be willing to contribute. So it may be an important issue for the media also to convey this information. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And actually the paper was recently published in the Journal of Economic Behavior. And if you are interested in having a closer look, I refer to the paper. Okay, thank you. Now questions and comments and critiques and whatever.
Okay, can you hear us like that? Can you hear the questions from the audience?
No, I haven't heard.
Can you hear my voice now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, but maybe you can repeat what the question is.
No, I'm just calling for the audience questions, please.
It's a great idea actually to buy, to eliminate CO2.
You may also talk in Russian, and Alexis translates.
Okay, that please. Okay. Which publish that?
Thank you very much, but I'd like to know which media coverage do you consider to be the appropriate one? So how that should be implemented?
Well, I think this is, for instance, I can only talk about Germany. There is a lot of information in TV, in the journals. I also think about social media, but maybe official social media, who talk about this issue. And I guess what is important is in Germany, at least, we are rather aware of this catastrophic developments. But what is also important is to convey some confidence that you can do something, not just that you get rather anxious and say, I can't do anything, what shall I do? But if you have the feeling and also get some information about what you can do, then I think this will make sense. And I think this is important, but it's of course also important that you have to believe the media, right? That there in Germany you have different political directions, and it's important that you believe that what the media conveys is true. I think this is important. Did this answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Questions, please.
Thank you very much for interesting talk and very interesting design experiment with public good provision. And I have questions. First is very small. How can you explain the increasing part of contribution for CO2 decreasing? So we see on the 9th or 10th iteration that people contribute more on these effects.
What do you mean? How can I explain? You mean this picture or this picture?
They prefer to think better about themselves, or
I mean this backward bending, this U-shape.
What?
U-shape.
You have an increasing contributions to emissions reductions towards the end, and public good as well, actually. Yeah, emissions. Yeah.
You mean in the emission treatment? You mean this picture that in the beginning? What we thought is
a U-shaped curve, right? In both cases.
You mean here the decay and then the stable and then getting up.
Yeah.
What we think is that in the beginning, maybe they take the average. This is feedback, right? They take the average of the people in the lab as a kind of benchmark. How much to contribute, what others may contribute, because you do not know what people outside the lab do, and then more or less keep this stable. You also have this this here, and well, it may, these are averages. It may be even that after some kind of several periods, that you still think, okay, why not do put something more into the lab? It may help, right? So if you are convinced that it makes sense to contribute and that we should, then it's a kind of goal. Then you don't do something bad to yourself, because you don't think just about money, you think about the environment. And then it's if you put this in your utility function, then it's no harm for you, right? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And continuing this question, did you see something, some difference from different groups, the behavior of the people in different experiments? For example, if in the laboratory people see that nobody contributes, they even if this money will be spent for CO2 emission reduction, you won't contribute if you see that nobody else do the same. And if most people prefer to contribute much more, you join them. So the first iteration is very important, I think, for
yeah, the kind of information they get is important. As I told you here, they get only the average, right? They got only, we did not give them the information who each of the 60 or 30% contributed. In this large experiment, you can't do that. In the experiment that we run with Alexis, that where only were 6 group members, then we informed them exactly what the others did. So here they get only the average, and the average is of course an average, an aggregated number from those who didn't contribute, who may contribute everything or anything in between. But these phenomenon that there are these imperfect conditional cooperators, they are in a way behaving like you mentioned. They say something like, well, still not everybody contributed, and why should I contribute as much as the others? I will always contribute a little bit less than the average. And that seems to cause this downward spiral here. But in our experiment, you cannot really see how many did not contribute anything and how many did a lot. That we can't see, but you can see that obviously on average people contributed less, and that's the decay. Actually, there was an idea to run these kind of experiments in different countries. And we even thought about maybe with the help of Alexis, one can do it also in Russia. It would be interesting to have it in different countries where the awareness of CO2, of climate protection is more or less pronounced. It's there are quite some other countries where it may be the case, like in Germany, or much less. And it would be interesting to see how in such an RPG experiment, how behavior is there, whether you have the stable function there as well, or whether you have a decay or whatever. It's not completely clear. That would be something, and it's just what the first discussant mentioned, the lady. It depends also on the media and how this is this awareness is made obvious, right? Did I answer your question, or?
Thank you. And the last one, also continuing the previous, if we say about the possibility to organize this experiment in different countries or even in different regions that differ from each other, maybe it's possible to find some differences. Which factors impact more provision public goods? For example, men or women. For example,
could also be different.
How rich people are. Maybe.
I do not remember whether we also put in the, well, we have also regressions and so on in our paper. I do not remember whether we put male or female into it also, but it's not so easy to disentangle that the gender effect, because you have 60 people and they interact over 10 periods, and it's interaction. So I think you have to have another experiment where, if you want to disentangle the gender effect to maybe with smaller groups, or only women and only male or whatever, to disentangle that. But it could be, and I guess also in Russia, in different regions, it would be interesting. So if I am informed correctly, in Siberia, you had a lot of fire also this year, did you?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, in the forest, right? And in these regions, I think there will be maybe more willingness to contribute to climate change than in others, maybe more in the north, but somewhere else you have less temperature and have a problem from there. So in Germany now, some years ago, many people didn't care, but this year in Germany, it was for months. In Bonn, where I'm from, in the middle of Germany, for months where it didn't rain, and last year we had this floods in just near Bonn, where we had 184 people were dying from the floods, and this is what happened already in other parts of the world, right? And now that it reaches us, it's not that I can say suddenly you are aware, but suddenly you are suffering, and this, of course, has an impact. And I guess this might have an impact in Russia, or in other countries would have an impact as well. And such an experiment would be something like a kind of measurement, how aware people are, and whether, at least for students, this money, what they can earn, is something. It's not such a large amount from the perspective of others who for adults or who are working, but still for students, you can go to the student cafeteria, you can pay several meals from that, you can go, I don't know, in the cinema or what else you can do with the money. So for them it makes some difference whether they keep the money or whether they donate it, more or less, provided. So yeah, okay, but I'm talking too much, I guess.
Thank you very much again.
also like to know if the participants were given some extra information concerning the CO2 emission and warning about the consequences of it before the experiment or after, and if their knowledge was somehow defined, I mean, by a test or a survey. So
you mean how much they knew before?
How much they knew before, yeah, and how much do you know, if you know, about their general awareness in this topic? I mean, the students who participated.
I think in these experiments, we did not apply. Now, the only thing that we applied, I think, was personality traits questionnaire. We didn't ask them how much they knew or not. We did not, because the experiment was, at least at that time, it was rather complicated experiments with putting these together. Now, several years later, we are more used and we have the tools with Zoom and other things now to do it. But at that time, this was not so easy. And I think one reason was also that we didn't want to ask them too many questions at the end in order not to extend. I think how much time we asked, this was already 1.5 hours here, and on average, the session lasted 90 minutes. Yeah, I can say, no, we didn't ask for that. What we did, but we told them, we informed them about what CO2 emission means and how much the price was and of how much the average the emission per capita. So we had a rather large introduction in addition to the usual instructions in the VCM. But it's a good idea if one does something similar. Now we would ask such questions. Actually, Alexis, in our German Russian experiment on also on climate change, we asked some questions, right? And there we found that those who were aware and of climate change and who were also involved in climate protection, and we asked for different behaviors. There we found that they were more willing to contribute or contribute to avoiding climate change in that experiment. And I guess if we had asked for that in this experiment as well, we might have found something similar, yeah.
Thank you.
But it's a good idea next time.
Can I have a couple of quick questions?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then one question is, as usual, I'm in the last years, I'm more interested in heterogeneity, right? So, how are the average contributions by treatment?
Yeah.
Was there any interesting trends, like, for instance, when, particularly in emissions treatment, when, for instance, someone under-contributes and someone else becomes a more extensive contributor, contributes more than usual, for instance? Was there any compensation for under-contribution of someone by someone else, or not? Or was it rather uniform? And then what causes people to over-contribute to emissions reduction? Which characteristics of individuals are conducted for this? Have you looked at the individual patterns?
As far as I know, we didn't we didn't look at we didn't look at that, because see, this is different from what we did in the experiment I have mentioned already, because people were only informed about the average, and one reason why we only gave them the average was because you have so many. You have 60 or 30 or 100 people where you cannot somehow give individual information. And the other reason was depending on on group size, well, sometimes the if you have 60 or 30, then the amount, the absolute amount will differ, right? And then comparison would not be so easy. So to give a short answer, no, we didn't look for that. It may be interesting to look at the individual contributions, but we didn't do it. Maybe it's another task for the future to look into the data again.
That's for future research. That's for future research. Yeah. And another question I had was basically, sorry. Yeah. Another question I had was kind of more general to this treatment in principle, because you know, the emissions treatment basically is effectively it's a kind of social construct, right? That people buy something which they commonly believe to be harmful for the society as a whole, not only those sitting in this room, right? Mm-hmm. And basically they buy out their right to say, I am a good citizen and I am contributing to common cause, right? Mm-hmm. So public game is a contribution which is material for everyone in this group and in this group only, right? But this one is actually a purchase of a socially acceptable, socially appreciated, right? Socially approved position in general, outside of the lab. So they're not comparable, strictly speaking, right, in this sense. And
yeah, you're right.
On the other hand, instead of CO2 emissions, you could have sold as well, for instance, contributions to the orphanage or contributions to the World Wildlife Foundation or anything else, right? So CO2 emission is just one possible commonly believed public good, but there are others, right? Yeah. And we should have compared that, technically speaking, to the willingness to contribute, for instance, to the orphanages or to the, I know, to the cultural heritage foundations, to the wildlife foundations, and things like that. So basically, so what we see, okay, yeah. So and then my question would be, could you maybe think about how to measure the value of, strictly speaking, CO2 emissions reduction? First of all, by, of course, comparing emissions treatment with donations to other charities or other foundations. And on the other hand, another option might be to have something like a outsiders group or a third group, which would appreciate your contributions to. So you could basically construct the whole world in a yet larger lab, saying that, for instance, you are the acting participants. There's another group of non-acting participants sitting in the next room, right? For instance, and if you contribute to the this quotation marks and CO2 emissions, then both your income and the income of the other guys in the next room, right, will increase depending on how much do you contribute to that, right? Then there would be kind of global story. Whereas in your case, it's a story.
Yes, of course. Now that we did this basic things, you can of course think about quite some extensions. And with the tools that you have now, it may be easier also to run experiments with large groups. But you remember running our experiments with 6 people, even though this was at that time was also Z3. So we were rather happy that we first of all could run the experiments in these large groups, which has not been done, and also the amount of people that we needed. I think with smaller groups, maybe you can do it as you did, as you suggested. And yes, it's clear that in a way they are not comparable, because the alpha is nearly not existent, and in the other you know something. But our motivation was, we were interested in, well, you had up to now you had the VCM, and you used the outcomes of the VCM often for explanations, not you but others, and also with regard maybe to climate change and whatever. And what we show, at least, we were really willing to make the two designs as similar as possible. But of course, the CO2 emission is something different than a real public good, but still it has features of a public good. It's not just a donation. Well, actually, it's interesting. One of our reviewers had exactly that point and said, well, why do not run a dictator game or give some donation? But it is a public good, right? In a way, but with a different, as you may say, a different design or with different features. Yes, and well, what my supervisor Reinhard Selten always then said, if there were all these kind of interesting suggestions for new experiments, he said, well, do it, right? Yes, you are right, one could do it, but at the moment our focus was on comparing VCM and this kind of RPG. And then, of course, now having done this, there are a lot of extensions that could be done, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think unless there are any other urgent questions, we wanted to thank you, Heike, very much for your very interesting talk, very intriguing talk, and thanks for being with us, and have a good day. Right? Have a good evening. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It was nice. It was nice talking to you.
Thanks, Heike. Yeah.
Okay, bye.
I'll drop your short note later on, okay?
Yeah.
Окей, ну что, можно, наверное, снова